First of all, welcome to everyone who's here for the April 2021 EMBA members meeting. We're going to have kind of two halves of the meeting. The first half will be dedicated more for the experienced beekeepers as we discuss swarming control and requeening, and the last half of the meeting tonight will be for the beginners. So we're going to discuss how to install a nucleus colony, how to what to expect in that big day. So as we proceed, at the bottom of your screen, you'll notice there's a chat area and a Q&A area. So any technical issues you might be having, if you could please keep the technical problems in the chat area, and then any questions that you have for me, if you could put those in the Q&A section, then that would work out once we get closer to the Q&A time. So that's the first thing I wanted to discuss. We, of course, last meeting, I unfortunately shared the news of a beekeeper who passed away named Bob Graham. And our guest speaker for the March meeting was Grant Gillard. And it pains me to inform people who don't know that since the last meeting that unfortunately Grant Gillard has passed away. And he was such a great man, such a great beekeeper. He was the former president of the Missouri State Beekeeping Association. He was a friend to many beekeepers in the St. Louis area, was so generous with his time and his resources, his knowledge, that we all will miss such a great guy. So I am happy to say that Tim Hyde put a lot of work into editing the March meeting, and he broke it up into two sections. He put one section as Grant's talk, and then the last half, because it was 2 hours long, the last half is the Q&A session, and he's got those both uploaded onto YouTube. And if you go to YouTube and you search EMBA, you're going to run into a gazillion results. So if you search for either I used EMBA space March and it pulled up the meeting, or you can try Eastern Missouri Beekeeping Association as a search tool. Both of those, you might also include Grant's name, Grant Gillard, and that should get you into where you can look and watch the meeting and possibly one of Grant's last beekeeping talks. So we were privileged to have him here for our meeting. So with that being said, we'll move on to April management issues. This, in a way, is like a month in beekeeping, where we talk about what beekeepers should be doing this time of the year, this month. And April is one of the busiest months, it seems to me, as a beekeeper. You're trying to take care of your bees while you're juggling sometimes questionable weather, cool weather, rainy weather, and that makes it difficult to do things sometimes in a timely manner. But we're going to discuss what you should be seeing in your hives this time of the year, and what to do, when you do find queen cells, or how do you make a split. So hopefully I'm able to answer some of those questions. I will say that after you log on to the EMBA's website, there's two forms or two articles that I found on our site that would be very useful. One of them is called April Hive Management in St. Louis. And while I printed a copy, it won't be of much help for you at home watching this. This is probably a 7 or 8 page form that's got a lot of great information. I'm fairly certain that Bob Sears was instrumental in putting this together. And the other one is one called Swarming Control. So both of those articles are a fairly quick read, but have a lot of great information that I'm going to kind of what are we finding when we go into hives? In my own bee yard, I know that I've been in all my colonies at least 2 or 3 times and have been trying to figure out, where the hives are in regards to their strength, in regards to their swarm impulse. The literature in the first article, the April hive management article in St. Louis, the information there is very useful, but it starts off, kind of at the beginning of April, and we're right now in part of the middle of April. And so when you're trying to assess the strength of your colony, they use kind of a guideline in the St. Louis area of around 4 frames of brood, 4 frames worth of brood. So you might have brood on multiple frames, but we're trying to get kind of a grand total of how much brood you have in the colony. And 4 frames worth the first week of April is a good rule of thumb. The second week of April, then you should be looking at 5 frames, and for every week you should be looking at about 1 more frame of brood. So 5 to 6 frames of brood this time of the year would be what we would consider ideal. Some colonies may have less brood, some colonies might have more brood, and what you do after you determine how much brood you have and how much resources, how much honey, how much pollen, will be determined by your outfit or your bee yard size. A person who has 1 colony is going to operate differently than someone who has 10 colonies. You have more options when you have 10 colonies. But usually when you go into a colony, you're looking for somewhere between 15 and 20 pounds of honey. So I like to think of that as a deep frame holding about 6 pounds of honey. So you want 3 to 4 frames of honey, and you're also wanting to have open comb for the queen to lay. This is the time of the year when swarming becomes a major concern, and the way to prevent swarming, one of the ways is to provide ample room for the queen to lay. And so when I go into my colonies, you might find that you find the conditions of having too much honey or not enough honey, or too much brood. And so what do you do in that situation? Well, if you have too much honey, meaning more than, let's say, 4 frames worth of honey in the box, I would position the honey to be on the outside walls, so frames 1 and 10 in both the bottom box and the top box. And you're going to have other frames that will have partial honey and probably open comb or partial honey and pollen, and you'd want to put those frames next. And then you'd want your brood to be in the center, and you'd want your open comb to be between your brood and your honey or your pollen. And so that's what you're going to want to do. If you only have a couple colonies and you find you have too much honey, the best thing to do is to pull frames of honey out, freeze them, and then put frames of foundation, or if you have it, frames of comb in place, following that same kind of layout where you have honey, pollen, empty comb, and brood in the middle. If you can kind of keep things organized in that way, it'll be better for your colony. But that's what you're going to want to try to do. Most of us, if we were in time, we would have tried to reverse our hives if the conditions were right. Usually this is done at the early part of April, where if you're into the hives soon enough, you might find that the colony has moved up and that a majority of the brood is up in the top box, and the bottom box is really void of anything except empty comb. And you can usually swap the boxes, giving them room above, and the colony will want to move and work their way up into that box. But again, that's something that's usually done earlier in the month. At this point, when I go into my colonies, I'm finding anywhere between 5 and 10 frames of brood. Some hives have more honey than others, and so when you have a bee yard with more than 1 or 2 colonies, you can equalize the resources in the bee yard. So how do you go about doing that? And so what you try to do is get a count of what you have in each of your hives. Some hives in my bee yard have, the top box is very heavy. I might have 6 or 7 frames of honey in the top box and 2 or 3 frames in the bottom box. And I often think to myself, especially after the rough winter we had, you know, what did you eat all winter that there's this much honey left over? And other hives have, you know, maybe 2 frames of honey. So I would make sure that I knew where my queen was at in any colony that I'm moving frames. I think that's probably one of the most important messages before I go much further, is that you want to know where your queen is at. And so if I'm moving frames and I'm not skilled at finding a queen, I would probably want to shake the bees off that frame before I decided to move it to another colony. But if you try to give everybody an even playing field when it comes to frames of brood, when it comes to frames of honey and pollen and open comb, then everyone has a more even playing field, and it's easier for them to take off and not have some colonies that are overpowered and some colonies that are you know, a little behind in their development. So when I'm going into my colonies now, I'm also finding some colonies that are starting to make queen cells. And that's something that you're going to find in some of your colonies. Before I talk about queen cells and how to proceed with those, I tend to try to provide additional space in the colony by adding a super or 2, depending on how strong the colony is. And I'm using supers that are drawn out. You may not have drawn out supers. So if you have a super that you want to add that hasn't been drawn out yet, I would just add 1 at a time until they start drawing it out, and then following the traditional rule of 7 or 8 frames, and then add another box that you would have, you know, followed whenever you were getting your hive originally built. You want to make sure that you are providing them honey storage space by adding supers. And, you know, around here in St. Louis, the first main nectar flow probably is going to be the black locust bloom. And we're probably less than 2 weeks away from that. Usually it's the first week of May or the last week of April, depending on how warm of a season we have. So that can be, you know, right around the corner for us. And so by providing additional room for the colony in the way of either an additional deep box, if you wanted to give them ways to build comb and more room for the queen to lay, you can provide more room and space by providing a super for the colony. Either way, it's important that you're providing as much room as you can for the colony, but you know, within reason, not too much room where hive beetles, if the colony isn't strong, have a place to take up and cause problems. So back to probably the most challenging part of keeping bees, your second year and every year, you know, from then, and that is controlling swarming. Like I said, my colonies, I would say that a majority of them have begun to make queen cups. Some of them have become active, meaning that the queen has laid eggs in those cups. And that's a sign that the colony, the swarm impulse has taken over, and that colony is wanting to divide, which is a very natural process. Most healthy, strong colonies will want to reproduce on a colony level, which is really what swarming is. And so trying to fight that and control that can be challenging, and there are a lot of different ways to attempt to stop colonies from swarming. If you don't have queens yet, and for a lot of us in the EMBA, our queen delivery is expected to be this coming Saturday, and so most of us don't have our queens yet. Many of the easier ways of controlling swarming by splitting colonies. Most of those things are easier when you have your queens in hand. It just makes it where you have less work by having your queens. And so once you do get your queens, one of the ways to help control swarming is by reducing the size of the nest. And basically, you are going to create a division in the colony, which is what a swarm is, but on your own terms. And so it saves you from having to go out and chase a colony out of a tree by dividing a colony and making up a nuke, which you could use as, or divide as an additional colony for yourself, or as a way to keep your colony numbers the same, and possibly, you know, sell that or give the divide away to a beekeeping friend. There's a lot of people this time of the year who are looking for bees, who are looking for nucleus colonies, people who want to increase, people who had hives that died out. And so whenever you have a colony that's available, it usually doesn't sit around very long before people are anxious to get it. So how do you make up a divide or a nuke, let's say? So when we think about a nuke, we usually think about a 5-frame or a 4-frame division of a colony. So it's a baby hive that would fit in a box like this, 5 frames in size. And so what would I take from my strong colony to put into a nuke box if I was going to make up a nucleus colony? And so if you have one hive, again, it really limits your options. But if you have multiple colonies, what I would do would be to equalize, go through my colonies, get them to the point where there are, as we discussed earlier, six frames worth of bees and brood in there, and any excess would go off into its own box. So I would limit the amount of bees. Again, we would want to know where our queen was at when we decide to do this. So we would want to keep the queen here, as this is one of the options, keep the queen in this colony, pull the excess frames of brood out and put them into a box for the time being. If there's excess honey, pull those out. If there's empty comb that you have, then you'd want to position the rest of the frames in this box the same way we discussed earlier, where you have honey, you have pollen, you have empty comb or foundation, and then you have your 6 frames of bees and brood in the middle. So if you can do that through all your colonies, whatever you have left, all your extra, you could then decide to make splits out of. But a normal nucleus colony for me would be 3 frames, 2.5 to 3 frames worth of brood, preferably capped brood. And I'll get around to why in a second. Preferably capped brood, and then 2 frames of resources, honey, honey pollen. That's what you'd be looking for. And then you would take your queen that you purchased, and you would want to add that queen or introduce her to your nucleus colony. And your queen is going to come in one of the different queen cages, depending on where you source her from. But most of the EMBA queens come in what we call a Benton cage, which is a 3-hole cage, and there's a cork on either end, and there's candy on one of these 3 sections, and a piece of wax paper over it. So you refer to it as the candy end and then the standard cork end. So if you took the cork out of the other end, the queen and the attendants could walk right out. So what we would prefer to use is the side where there is the fondant or the icing, the candy there, and that acts and serves as a time release for the colony to get access to the queen. It takes them time to eat through the candy, to release her, to create a tunnel for her to come out. So we would want to add this queen cage to the colony, and if you're adding it, depending on the size of the box that you're putting it in, some of the white plastic kind of nuke boxes that you fold together. That's what I tend to use because there's an area or a space above the frames, which is ideal for laying a queen cage like this. There's plenty of room, and I have room for all my frames, and I have room for a queen cage. In a box like this, you would just have to check and see, and you might have to remove a frame if there's not enough room for the queen cage to be inserted. But you'd want to insert the queen cage where the bees have access to the screen side. So the bees have to be able to communicate to the queen and have to be able to feed her. And so when you put this in, if you have your frames in here, I'll lift this up so we can see, hopefully. You'd want to have this with the candy side up. You'd want to put this in here between these two frames where the bees have access to the queen. We do it candy side up so that her exit path, if one of these attendants in here die for some reason, you don't want gravity to bring that attendant, the dead bee, down and block off the queen's exit. And so you put the candied end up, and it also makes it easier when you open this to see that you can look down into this after you've already released her and see that they've eaten through the candy. It just makes it easier so you can see that. So that's how you would kind of set up a nucleus hive. And when it comes to queen introduction, since a majority of us are going to be getting queens, the way that I typically do it is you have a cork on both ends, and I usually will leave this cage corked and put it in the colony for 3 or 4 days. And I then pull it out, and I mentioned earlier that you wanted to use capped brood. And the reason for that is that there's 2 reasons. I want this colony to fall in love with this queen, and I don't want them to use the resources in this hive, you know, eggs and very young larvae. I don't want them to try to raise their own queen whenever they lose the pheromone scent of their old queen. They're going to want to go into queen panic mode and start making queens. And so I want to try to eliminate that as an option. And if I give them capped brood, it limits what they can do. So if I leave her caged and corked on both ends in the hive here for, let's say, 4 days, 3 or 4 days, I then come back in and I open up the box and I pull the cage out, set it off to the side, and then I pull the frames out and I just look for any queen cell development. This is a way to help ensure that they do fall in love with her. And if I see queen cells on maybe some young larvae that were off on the side, so majority of the brood in the middle will be capped. You might have some younger brood over here on the perimeter, and if they make a queen cell, what I do is I pull the frame out, and with my hive tool, I will I'll cut the queen cell and then put the frame back together again. And what that does is eliminates their options once again for doing anything except falling in love with the queen that you have. So I put the frames all back together again, put the queen right back in, and at that point, I feel confident enough that if I don't see any queen cells, I'll pull the cork on the candied end. If I do see queen cells when I go in and I eliminate them, then usually I'll let that cork stay in for maybe another day or 2, and then I'll pull the cork because I know that the pheromones and the colony will get back into shape. To me, queen introduction is something that I don't like to rush because it's a pain to find additional queens. So if for some reason you rush this and they reject the queen that you've given them, well, now you're on the hunt for another queen. Or you allow them to raise a queen from the brood that they had which may be okay, and it may have been too old to be a high quality queen. And so then you're left with possibly a queen that is subpar. So I'm sure I'll have some questions about queen introduction. That's a Benton cage, the 3-hole cage. The JZBZ cage is the plastic cage that many of you have seen. If you're getting your queens in this, what I like to do is use a finishing nail and being careful to slide this small finishing nail that's probably 1.5 inches, 2 inches long through the end of the cage where there's a hole. And then that allows you to suspend the cage between frames without the queen cage falling down into the box. So that's the way that you would do it there. It does put the candied end down, which is not ideal, but the way that this cage is designed, that's probably one of the best ways of suspending it. So let's see, we're about 7:30. So we've talked about equalizing the brood nest. We've talked about the requeening of the colony. You're going to want to put her in the center of the brood nest. So when you make this up, you want her to be in the center of the box. The bees are going to be attracted to her. They're going to be spreading her pheromones around. And so when you put her in the nest, as close to the center of the brood nest as possible, that's what they recommend. If you've got a colony that is trying to swarm, getting back to swarming, one of the things you can do is to cage the current queen. Okay, so the queen is laying a whole bunch of brood in the colony, and one of the things you can use is, I call it a crack pipe, but it's I got this from Isabee's years ago, and it has kind of a bulbous end that has a hole or an opening here that you would use. And what I do is hold the frame, and you place this very gently over the queen as she's walking on the frame, and she'll crawl up into this tube. And when she does, then you have to be ready, and you can block off the entrance. And if you have your queen cage handy, then you put your queen cage, you line up the hole of your queen cage, and then if you just blow a little bit of air, and she'll go right, it'll shoot her right into the cage. And so then you can put corks or some electrical tape or something on there that the bees won't chew through. And if you leave her in there, her pheromones are still continuing to go around into the colony, but it eliminates her from being able to continue to lay eggs for some time until the brood nest can kind of empty out. And then you have more open comb, and that's one of the methods that you can try. When we think about doing some bee math, in the St. Louis area, the majority of the honey that's produced in a colony, it happens from the first week of May until about the first week of July, usually. It might extend a little further than that, sometimes depending on the weather, but usually that's what you're looking at. So the month of May, the month of June. So you've got about 8 weeks there. And we know from our studies in beekeeping biology that it takes 21 days or 3 weeks to go from an egg to a hatched, not a hatched, I should say an emerged worker bee. So you've got 3 weeks there. The first 3 weeks of the worker bee's life is spent doing inside chores inside the colony. And so after her 3rd week, she then graduates and is now a forager. So it takes 6 weeks to produce a forager from an egg. And so when you think about the time frame of when our nectar flow is, when the bees are bringing in honey, at some point in the season, the eggs that the queen is laying really aren't going to have any impact on our honey production for this season. When we count back 6 weeks from the end of the honey flow, so 6 weeks from the first week in July, when you go back, then you're talking the latter half of May. So any bees that are laid, any eggs that are laid after the latter half of next month, they will be developing and becoming foragers right about the time that everything dries up. And so this time of the year, when we think about what impacts our honey harvest, it's the work that we're doing now, it's the management that we're doing now in order to keep our colonies strong enough that they're able to bring in the black locust nectar without becoming too strong where they want to swarm. And in my own bee yard, after I've done my equalizing, after I have requeened colonies that are too, the queen isn't doing a good enough job, or for whatever reason I want to requeen them. In order to do that in your colonies that are your larger colonies, you have to find your old queen in order to remove her to add your new queen. Now there's ways to do that by splitting the colony. When it comes to spring management, you'll find that there's 100 ways of doing every step, not only in spring management, but anything in beekeeping. And that's frustrating for a lot of people. But usually in my production colonies, I would find the old queen, remove her, and then the same process I used for my nucleus colony is the same process I would use for my adult colonies, so that I would be able to make sure that they're accepting my queen and not producing one on their own. And so, you know, I go through, do my evaluation, my equalizing, requeen if necessary, and give them as much space as I can. I super early, and then I begin kind of a technique we just call cutting queen cells. So I go through and monitor my hives. I tend to be a little on the hands-on side of beekeeping. I like to know what's going on inside my colonies all the time. If I run into a problem, I have time to address it, and I'll go in and start making sure that I cut queen cells in an effort to keep swarming from taking place in my colonies. By doing that, yes, it's a lot of work, but it's something that will allow me to produce a lot of honey in a colony. I think last year my best hive filled 5 medium supers and then filled a deep on top of that. So, you know, it is a lot of work, but in order to generate a tremendous amount of honey, that's the path that I choose, and that's the route that I take. So when I start cutting queen cells, I have to make sure to get all of them. If I miss one queen cell, that's all that colony needs in order to swarm. You know, when they start laying eggs into the cups, they will cap the queen cell on the 8th day. And after that, the colony can leave. And so I try to go in there on a weekly basis and do inspections and make sure that they're not developing queen cells. If they are, I remove those queen cells in the colonies that are doing that. And usually I have a pretty high success rate, and that allows me to produce, you know, a ton of honey. So I'm sure there are things that I'm not remembering to say, but if Michael Wagner and the rest of the crew are ready, I want to leave a few minutes for questions before we begin on the beginner session. And before I go much further, I wanted to mention this earlier. It slipped my mind. So you'll see above me is a sign we're
coming to you live.
Coming to you live, exactly. Coming to you live from Isabee's in Fenton. Jane and Scott have a great location here for anyone who is interested in holding Zoom events, or if you have ideas, I would encourage you to get a hold of Jane or Scott and talk to them about anything that you might have in the works. It's a great location, and it's going to work out great for this event. And I'm very happy that we were able to put this together tonight. Okay.
You're not going to see the questions after all. Sorry.
Okay.
We'll get Mike on here.
So if Michael Wagner, if you're around there,
I'm ready.
see any questions,
Yes,
feel free
Scott,
to start
Okay.
off.
I'm ready. Scott asked, how long will my queen be okay in the cage that I pick up Saturday night if the nighttime temperatures are too cool for splitting?
Okay, I think I heard that. How long will my queen be okay in the cage? We're picking up queens on Saturday. The last I looked, I think they said the high of like 55 degrees, which is not ideal, you know, temperatures for working bees or making splits. So you've got a couple different options there. I haven't looked at the weather, and I really should have before I got on here tonight. So in situations like that, I've done a couple different things. If the weather is nice on Friday, what I've often done is put together my nucleus colonies or my splits the day before, like on Friday. I put them in nucleus boxes, and when I get my queens, I just walk out, open the lid, put the queen cage on top of the brood nest, close the lid, and I'm finished for the time being. If you decide that you don't want to do that and you want to wait, usually what we do is we'll prepare a queen box before I go pick up my queens. And a queen box can be a cardboard box, can be any kind of any box. I would put some screen on it, something for ventilation. And inside, I usually take a snack size, or let's say a quart size Ziploc bag. Take 2 paper towels, fold them into eighths, fold it down, slide it into the Ziploc bag, and wet that paper towel down, and then cut an opening in that bag so that the bees have moisture. You can also use a sponge or something like that. So they need moisture, and they also would need some food. So what I usually do is mix up some honey and some powdered sugar, something like that, and create a kind of a thick candy. And I'll put that in a little tinfoil little container and set that in a cardboard box. And then my queen cages go inside there, and any bees that are on the outside will help feed and take care of those queens. And you can keep queens caged like that and in you know, in a box like that for many days. You know, I've seen it done for a week, longer than that. You know, it's in an ideal situation, you want to get them in as soon as you can, but I understand that sometimes the weather doesn't cooperate, and that's beekeeping in St. Louis in April and in May sometimes, that it doesn't always work out like you would like. So hopefully I answered that. Michael, what else do you have?
Okay, I got a question from Tim. I have found queen cells in the middle of one frame in the upper deep. I still have the queen in the hive, and I'm wondering if this hive decided to requeen itself. Should I move the cells to the lower deep, split the colony, or requeen, or leave them where they are located, or remove them and place in a nuke? Rather lengthy question.
That was a lengthy question, and I caught the last half of it. If you could repeat the first part of it to me again.
I have found queen cells in the middle of one frame in the upper deep. I still have the queen in the hive, and I am wondering if the hive decided to requeen themselves.
Okay. So you're finding them on the face of the frame, not on the bottom where you typically would see swarm cells. That's one of those situations where it's hard to know for sure what to do without knowing more about the colony, about what you see, how is the queen doing, what does the brood look like, you know, what is your general assessment of the queen? Do you think she's doing a good job? I've often seen where and I've got several colonies where this is happening, where there are queen cells on the bottom of the frame where you traditionally would see them, but I'm also seeing some queen cells that are being pulled from the foundation up higher on the comb. And usually in my bee yard, I'll just analyze the situation, look at the colony. On a couple of them that they're doing that to, the queen looks tremendous. Her pattern is as solid as can be. I don't see any issues at all. They're gentle, you know. And so what I do in my yard is remove those cells after I've made sure to locate my queen, so I know my queen hasn't left. And then I kind of keep an eye on them and just see what they continue to do. As a matter of fact, usually what I'll do is I've got a Sharpie and I'll draw an eyeball on the top of my frame and an arrow pointing left or right, whichever side it is, as a way to remind me to keep an eye on that spot, because I'm used to seeing the lower section of the frame. I'm used to finding swarm cells down here, but the bees can be very tricky and they can really hide things where it's easy to overlook. And so if I see a queen cell or something coming off here on the top part of the frame or in the middle where I might overlook it, that's an easy way to make a note to myself on the top of the frame, just to say, hey, keep an eye on that. So for right now, I would just wait and see kind of what they do with that. Exactly, that's, Scott just mentioned another great point. If they're just queen cups, that's a different situation than if they're active cells. So a queen cup is when they just make the domed beginnings of a queen cell. And if we say queen cell, then to me that implies that it's an active queen cell, meaning that there has been an egg and there's royal jelly, and that they're determined that, you know, they're actively working on generating a queen from that cell. And so in the ones in my hives, they were just cups, they were just there, no eggs were present. And so I just removed them at this point, waiting to see what they decide to do with that. And I'll revisit that at a later date. If they're active queen cells or cells and you're happy with the way your queen is working out, it all depends on how much work you want to put into this. So if it was my colony and I was happy with the way the queen is working out, I would probably, again, this is just me talking out loud, how I would handle this. I would probably monitor the hive, cut the queen cells, and wait until later in the season before I decided to let them requeen themselves, if I was interested in getting a lot of honey from them this season.
Lonnie says that queen cell is capped.
Oh, it's capped. Okay. So if the queen cell is capped, well, then you could remove the current queen, put her into a nucleus colony. You could allow that queen cell to hatch and to take over that colony, you know, once she returns. Usually what I do in situations like that is I remove any other queen cells and give them an option of either 1 or 2 cells. Usually if it's a colony that's really trying to swarm, I'll reduce it down to 1. I've had pretty good success. You're banking on the fact that the queen leaves and comes back mated and doesn't get lost. But usually that's what I would do, would be to remove the current queen. If you want to, you could kill her if she's not doing a good job. But if you wanted to make like a reverse split, you take the current queen out with some brood and make a nuke. You can make a small nuke out of that and allow that queen to mature, to emerge, and then to return mated and take over that colony. Hopefully that answered. When you get situations like that, there's a lot of different ways you can do it depending on what your goals are for the season. You know, for some beekeepers, their goal is to increase the number of colonies they have. They're trying to rebuild. Other beekeepers are trying to get a lot of honey. And so your management style would be different depending on what you're trying to accomplish. Okay, Michael, what else do you got?
Okay, this one's from Janet. I have heard from other beekeepers that splitting the hive 3 to 4 days prior to introducing the new queen will help the acceptance of the new queen after checking and removing any queen cups.
That waiting, so making up your nucleus colony 3 or 4 days prior to
Introduce the queen.
Prior to introducing the queen, she's heard that increases the chances. I have not heard that. Usually the recommendation is 1 day. Usually they say that you pull the queen, you wait a day, and then you introduce the new queen. If you pull the queen and wait 3 or 4 days, and then you would go in and remove queen cells, what you're doing is similar to what you would be doing with the nucleus colony as I described it, where you put the queen in and then you go in 3 or 4 days later, check for any queen cell development, remove that, and then put the queen back in. So if I'm understanding the question fully, to me, I don't see any disadvantage to leaving the current queen or the new queen in the box during that 3 or 4 days waiting time where her pheromones are being spread through the colony. I wouldn't leave her out in that 4-day period. I mean, if you're doing it before you're getting your queens, then I would say yes, as long as you go in and remove the queen cell development, because there will be queen cells as they are scrambling to replace her. They don't know that you've purchased a queen and she's supposed to arrive on Saturday. But yes, you know, I don't know that it increases it, but I would think that it would work.
Question from William. I split 3 colonies Sunday. Is it safe to put 2 gallons of sugar syrup on each, or is it too cold?
I don't think it's too cold to feed syrup. If you've got colonies that, I mean, it is getting cool in the evening, but then it's warming up to 50 or 60 degrees in the days. And so if I had colonies that needed food, that needed carbohydrates, and my splits did not have enough honey, that possible spring starvation was a concern, then I would say that yes, I would err on the side of giving them some syrup over letting them starve to death. So yeah, just make sure that if you're using a bucket feeder, that it's not dripping on the bees, you know, that the vacuum holds, and that you're not, you know, causing the bees to get all damp and then the temperatures drop.
Okay. Chris asked, is there a way to prevent swarming by moving the queen and making her think she has swarmed?
Is there a way to prevent swarming by removing the queen and making her think that she's swarmed? Well, that's kind of a partial question. So I would come back and say, when you say remove the queen, I would say move her where or how, you know, what exactly were you describing? But you can do what they call a reverse split, which is when you remove the current queen out of a colony and you allow them to requeen themselves, so that you've pulled brood out, you pulled the queen out and some resources, and you trick the parent colony into thinking that they have swarmed. And often that will help. But again, before I do that, I also want to limit their options. And so I would remove any additional queen cells and pick the nicest 1 or 2 cells that were left, and the rest of them would be removed. But just removing the queen itself, you know, I would say removing her to where you can cage her and keep her in the colony, and her pheromones continue to stay in the colony. And that just really solves the problem of a congested brood nest after a little bit of time. And they still accept her because she's still their queen, and they still pick up her pheromones and spread them. And then after, let's say after a week, then you could pull the cork and let her back out again, and a lot of the brood nest will have cleared up. So that's an option. So a little bit of an odd question, but hopefully I've answered that.
Okay. David asked, how do I best promote frames to be drawn out if I only have blank frames or no drawn out frames?
Let's see. How do you promote them to drawing out frames? Is that the question?
Yes.
Okay. So bees draw comb when there's a nectar flow. That's the best time to get bees to draw comb out. And there is a small nectar flow going on. There's fruit blooms. There's a lot of different flowers that are blooming that the bees are working. And so the bees need a nectar flow, and they also need to have the space. They need to feel the urgency of needing more room. And so usually whenever I'm getting bees to build comb, what I'll do is I'll put it in their way, so to speak. And so I want them to build the comb out as nice as I can get them to build it. And so in the middle of the brood nest, when the temperature's warm a little bit, I'll slide a frame of foundation in the middle of the brood nest, and the bees are there and they usually jump on it immediately. I'll do a frame at a time like that. I don't want to divide the brood nest up by putting, 3 or 4 frames of foundation in there and having the brood nest split, where there's a lot of distance between the two sides. But usually during a nectar flow, they will start bringing in nectar, and they'll want more room and space to store that. And that's usually the best way to get them to draw comb. I usually put that frame of foundation between 2 frames of capped brood. The more brood, the better. And I find that they draw the foundation out evenly on both sides when I do that, and they don't go crazy and make one side of the foundation drawn out, really fat, and the other side thin, which often happens if you put it on the outside where there are more frames of honey. That can often be drawn out irregularly. So I try to do it inside the nest, and I force it in their face really so that they have to deal with it. And usually they hop on it pretty fast. Another thing that I do, and this is definitely something for the advanced people, if you have an extractor that will extract a deep frame, what I often do in the springtime and summer is I'll use a deep as a super. And yes, it's very heavy. Yes, you have to have an extractor that will extract a deep frame. But if you can do that, the bees will draw those frames out beautifully. And then you extract the honey, and then you've got 10 beautifully drawn frames of comb that you can use the following spring when the bees are needing somewhere for the queen to lay. It's very nice to have frames of comb at your disposal that you can just slide in, and the bees can then continue. The queen can lay eggs, and they don't miss a beat. So again, this is something where planning ahead makes all the difference.
Okay. Holly asks, do you have the honey sugar pressed against the screen cage? I think that she's trying to address what you're talking about, how long the queen you could keep inside.
Okay. So maybe I should clarify. So the cardboard box that I usually keep my queens in has ventilation, and then I've got a little container for this honey, and powdered sugar is there usually just to kind of make it thicker so it's not running all over the place. And then the water, and I'll put those 2 containers inside something like a shoebox. And then my queen cages are inside there, and usually there are bees on the outside of the queen cage. There are usually attendants on the inside, but there are also loose bees on the outside, and the loose bees can go feed and pick up the moisture in the water and put that on the through the screen and feed the queen. If you don't have that, then usually what I'll do is apply a single drop of water about once a day to the candied end, where it kind of trickles down as close as I can get to the candy inside the queen cage to give the bees some moisture. And I usually put a drop of water once a day, maybe twice a day. And that's just to help allow them to, have the moisture they need to survive. And I keep them in a dark spot until I'm ready to use them. So hopefully that answered that.
Okay. Christian asked, how full does a second deep need to be before putting on a super?
How full does the second deep need to be? So that depends. How full should it be if they're drawing it out? In other words, if you've just added a second deep, usually we adhere to a 7 or 8 frames drawn out, or actively they're working on 7 or 8 frames before we add the next box. It doesn't matter what story it is. So in this case, a super, that would be the same situation. If you're talking about how full should it be with brood or with honey stores, I would say that if the frames are drawn and the bees are active in that, there's really no harm in putting, if you use queen excluders, I do, you don't have to, but if you do, putting a queen excluder down and then putting your super on top so that the bees can start that process of building comb as the nectar flow happens, because the bees are going to be aware of the nectar flow earlier than you're going to be aware of it. So you're going to go in and notice, oh my gosh, they've been building comb. They must need the space. And so I guess it depends on where your situation is on that deep box, as far as how much it's drawn out or what the conditions are, if it's comb from last year or if it's new foundation from this season. I think we'll have time for one more question.
One more question.
To the beginner side of things.
All right. This one is from Jennifer. We have a strong colony, 1 deep brood box. We found a particularly built queen cup a week ago with no egg in it and left it. Do we need to destroy this? Does this mean they're thinking of swarming?
Well, they're definitely thinking about it because they've built the queen cups, and queen cups are something you'll find in the colony throughout the year. But when they start building those, then you can tell where their mindset is at. I would say that if it's a single deep hive at this time of the year, what are your plans? If you have a single deep hive, any of my single deep hives at this point would have had a second box added so that they have room to expand. Because one of the main triggers for swarming impulse is feeling congested. So the colony needs to have ample space. And so if you have a single deep hive and you're trying to produce comb honey and you're trying to get that congested space in order to provide or to make good comb honey, okay, that's fine. But if you're wanting to build that up into a second deep, I would say that it's definitely time to add the second deep and then monitor that lower box. I would remove it if your plan is to keep that colony intact, meaning, do you plan on dividing that colony? Do you plan on just keeping that colony strong and producing a lot of honey? So depending on what your personal goals are with your box or your hive, that would dictate what you decide to do. If it were mine and I was going to try to get as much honey as I could, I would add a second deep and I would remove that queen cup. And then I would probably start, a pretty regular inspection schedule to make sure that during this crunch time that you don't have a colony that decides to swarm and then your honey harvest you'll still get some honey probably, but for the most part, your honey harvest is really severely reduced in a colony that decides to swarm. That's why I make every effort possible to keep a colony from swarming. That's their natural tendency, but I'm trying to keep that from happening so that I can benefit with a bigger honey harvest. So, okay, I don't want to shortchange the beginners. So I'm sure we've got other questions. I can't see the Q&A, just a couple. So if we get time at the end, then we can address those at the end of the meeting.